Mr. President, what's this about Japan? Churchill asked. It's quite true, Roosevelt replied. They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now. Churchill informed Roosevelt that Japanese troops had landed in Malaya, and promised to go before the House of Commons the following day and ask for a declaration of war. This certainly simplifies things, Churchill told the president, and added, God be with you. The Prime Minister's reaction to the news was unequivocal. He rejoiced. So we had won after all, Churchill wrote years later, in the now famous passage of his war memoirs. England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live. Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. All the rest was merely the proper application of overwhelming force. Since the war in Europe was not going particularly well at that moment, it was a daring prediction, and Churchill's comment to Roosevelt that Japan's sudden entry into the war simplifies things flew in the face of many perplexing complications. 18 months had passed since the fall of France, and Hitler was the seemingly invincible master of continental Europe. In June 1,941,148 divisions of the German Wehrmacht had poured across the Russian border, and by December they had advanced to within artillery range of Moscow. Britain had been at war for more than 2 years. It had stood alone against Germany for a year, and though it had absorbed the punishment of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign and escaped, for the moment, the threat of a cross-channel invasion, there was every risk of a renewed assault in 1942. Especially if the Soviet Union should collapse. Would Japan attack Russia in the east, freeing Hitler to transfer forces to the west? Would Japan overrun British colonies in Asia, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, perhaps even India? Would the Axis armies achieve a dreaded link-up in the Middle East? Would the sparsely populated nations of Australia and New Zealand be swallowed up? Perhaps even more alarming, would the United States channel its entire energy into the war against Japan, thereby starving Britain and Russia of tanks, airplanes, transports, weapons, and other vital war materiel? Churchill was vividly aware of all of those hazards, and yet he had the absolute conviction that Pearl Harbor, by jolting the United States out of its isolationist lassitude, would secure ultimate victory for the Allies. He recalled the words of Sir Edward Grey, 30 years earlier, concerning the entry of the United States into the First World War. America was like a gigantic furnace, Grey had said. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. With these hardening reflections in mind, Churchill went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. In Washington, at 4 in the afternoon, traffic at major intersections was blocked by trucks carrying troops of the District of Columbia National Guard. The telephone system was paralyzed by incoming calls. As members of the public sought news of the attack, additional operators were called in to work, but it was difficult to get a line anywhere, local or long distance. Machine gun nests had been hastily set up on the front steps and rooftops of public buildings. Marines were called out to guard the Capitol, and uniformed provost marshal guards, wearing steel helmets left over from the First World War era, appeared suddenly outside the War and Navy departments on the corner of 17th Street and Constitution Avenue. At the Japanese Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue, a large, sullen crowd was gathering on the sidewalk outside the gates. At one point, a man climbed out of a taxi and began throwing bottles at the building. Members of the embassy staff, reported the Philadelphia Inquirer, were seen to carry baskets of documents into the garden and began setting fire to them. Masuo Kato, a Japanese journalist, left the complex at about 4 p.m. looking up to the sky above the roof. He noted that white puffs were curling upward in the air. More documents were being burned on the roof. The crowd outside grew uglier, with several men cursing and shouting threats. As Kato made his way outside, the crowd surged toward him menacingly. They did not touch him, but one man said, "You are the last son of a bitch we were going to let out." District of Columbia Police and an FBI detail soon arrived and restored order. At the White House, where blackout restrictions had not yet taken effect, floodlights suffused the building and grounds in brilliant white light. Traffic on Pennsylvania Avenue slowed to a crawl as drivers stared. They seemed to crane their necks in the hope of catching a glimpse of the president or his men through the windows. Hundreds of spectators had gathered on the sidewalk outside the iron fence. A few men carried children on their shoulders. Police officers and Secret Service agents tried to keep them moving, but more arrived constantly throughout the late afternoon and early evening hours. Eventually they stood 3 or 4 deep. Some began to sing "God Bless America and My Country, 'Tis of Thee." About 50 or 60 reporters and photographers were clustered under the portico. One journalist, Merriman Smith, wondered if President Roosevelt could hear those unrehearsed songs coming spontaneously and from the hearts of the little people across his back lawn. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, as he entered the White House gate, noted that the crowd was quiet and serious and seemed to be responding to that human instinct to get near the scene of action even if they could see or hear nothing. 74-year-old Secretary of War Henry Stimson stepped out of his limousine and bounded up the steps like a mountain goat. Glenn Perry of the New York Sun recorded, and a light mist somewhat obscured the moon. Lights blazed in the State Department, and clerks just called to duty kept running across the sidewalk past the ancient cannons into the building. Shortly after nightfall, Grace Tully entered the president's office. He was alone, smoking a cigarette and sifting through the papers on his desk. "Sit down, Grace," he told her. "I am going before Congress tomorrow. I would like to dictate my message. It will be short." He inhaled deeply and let the smoke out. He began speaking, Tully recalled, in the same calm tone in which he dictated his mail. Only his diction was a little different as he spoke each word incisively and slowly, carefully specifying each punctuation mark and paragraph. The speech began yesterday, December 7, 1941. A date which will live in world history. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. When he had finished speaking, Tully was sent off to type the draft, which ran to some 500 words. When she brought it back for his review, the president drew a line through the phrase "world history" and wrote "infamy." The White House press room, which normally accommodated no more than 24 people, was jammed with more than 100 reporters, cameramen, and photographers. A long line of reporters waited for a turn at each of half a dozen telephones. The floor was littered with cigarette butts and a tangle of black cables running to the cameras and microphones. A battery of Klieg lights bathed the scene in a harsh electric glare. The room, observed BBC correspondent Alistair Cook, already had that air of tobacco-choked energy that is the Washington odor of panic. The press room was a madhouse, recalled Glenn Perry. Hilmer Bauchage, Fulton Lewis, Ted Wingo and other broadcasters were set up there, typing scripts and then reading them into their microphones with the crowd talking and working in the background. Roosevelt's press secretary, Stephen Early, had issued the first of several announcements at 2:30 p.m. glistening with sweat and squinting into the lights. Early had acknowledged that the Navy had suffered doubtless very heavy losses. Updates had followed every 15 or 20 minutes, and each time he arrived with a new statement, the room fell to a hushed silence and the reporters bowed over their notepads. It was the biggest story any journalist in the room had ever covered. At about 8 o'clock, the members of the cabinet began filtering into the Oval Study. They sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the president's desk. Behind the desk sat Roosevelt, who had changed into a rumpled dark suit, and was smoking a cigarette. Secretary of State Cordell Hull sat on a Chippendale armchair in front of the desk. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox stood hunched over the president, speaking to him in a low voice. Harry Hopkins, looking pale and gaunt, was the only non-member of the cabinet present. One of Roosevelt's naval aides briefed the cabinet secretaries on what had happened at Pearl Harbor. According to Labor Secretary Francis Perkins, Press Secretary Early was rushing back and forth saying, "They have had another telephone conversation with Admiral so-and-so. Things are worse than were reported earlier." At about 9 o'clock, when all had arrived, Roosevelt began to speak. He remarked that the cabinet was meeting under circumstances more dire than at any time since 1861, at the outset of the Civil War. The president's face, according to Perkins, was drawn and gray, with the muscles around his mouth showing tension and anger. Uncharacteristically, he did not offer so much as a quip or a half-hearted smile. Several of the secretaries, particularly those whose departments did not touch upon defense or foreign affairs, were not entirely sure what had happened in Hawaii. "We just got scraps of information, an episode here and there," wrote Perkins. "We got a picture of total confusion. Still, nobody knew exactly what had happened. Nobody knew where the planes had come from. This young naval aide had said they were from a carrier, but he was only assuming. Several times, in response to telephoned updates confirming the extent of damage to the fleet, Roosevelt groaned audibly. His anguish left a deep impression on the cabinet members. Whatever the commander-in-chief thought of the Army Air Forces, or the Marines, he was a Navy man in his bones. The feeling could be traced back to his childhood, when he had watched his distant and much admired cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, champion a major naval building program. He had read the works of Alfred Thayer Mahan diligently and cited them in debates and term papers at Groton and Harvard. He had learned to sail in the fog-shrouded waters off Maine and New Brunswick, and was by far the most proficient yachtsman ever to occupy the White House. He had personally amassed one of the world's largest collections of early American naval prints, paintings, documents, and ship models. He had served for 8 years as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Woodrow Wilson administration, his longest tenure in any job other than the presidency itself, and had taken direct responsibility for getting the Navy on a war footing in 1917-18. As president, he had signed major naval expansion bills in 1938 and 1940, aimed at building a Navy capable of fighting and winning simultaneous wars in the Atlantic and Pacific. It was obvious to me that Roosevelt was having a dreadful time just accepting the idea that the Navy could be caught off guard, Francis Perkins recalled. His pride in the Navy was so terrific that he was having actual physical difficulty in getting out the words that bombs had dropped on ships that were not in fighting shape and prepared to move, just tied up. I remember that he said twice to Knox, "Find out, for God's sake, why the ships were tied up in rows." Knox replied, "That's the way they berthed them." As the cabinet listened in rapt silence, Roosevelt read aloud the short speech he had dictated earlier that afternoon, which he planned to deliver to a joint session of Congress the following day. When he had finished, Hull and Stimson immediately raised objections to the limited scope of the speech, which indignation of the country at Japan's treachery in this surprise attack and not the full measure of the grievances we have against her as a confirmed lawbreaker and aggressor. Nor did it connect Germany with the attack. Hull, wrote Harold Ickes in his diary, pressed his point so hard that the president finally became a little impatient. Roosevelt was firm he preferred the short version. He wanted to channel the full force of the American people's fury, which would tend to unite them and put the bitter debates of the isolationists and interventionists behind them. Nor did the president want to mention Germany, since there was no hard evidence of collusion between Hitler and Japan. Roosevelt's draft was accepted as written. At about 10, congressional leaders joined the group. The cabinet members surrendered their chairs and stood against the walls, so that the study was now very crowded. To the congressmen and senators, the president gave a short summary of what was known about the attack. In response to a congressman who asked how the Japanese could have achieved such complete surprise, Roosevelt revealed his keen understanding of naval tactics by explaining that enemy carriers could have approached to within several hundred miles of Oahu under cover of darkness, foiling any American air patrols, and launched the airstrike before dawn. He admitted that it was not yet clear how seriously the American fleet had been damaged, but concluded, "The principal defense of the whole west coast of this country and the whole west coast of the Americas has been very seriously damaged today." The effect on the Congress was tremendous, Stimson wrote in his diary. They sat in dead silence, and even after the recital was over they had very few words. Someone asked if the president would be requesting a declaration of war, but Roosevelt would not reply directly, indicating that he had not yet made up his mind. Several congressmen flared up in anger that the U.S. Navy had been caught so badly off guard. Senator Tom Connally of Texas asked, "How did it happen that our warships were caught like tame ducks in Pearl Harbor? How did they catch us with our pants down? Where were our patrols?" Roosevelt replied, "I don't know, Tom. I don't know." As the congressmen filed out at 10:45 p.m., Roosevelt left them with an unsettling thought. While they slept that night, it would be daytime in Japan, the Philippines, and throughout East Asia. They're doing things and saying things during the daytime out there, while we are all in bed. One of the congressmen remarked, "We are in bed too much." As they left the White House, the congressional leaders were intercepted in the stone portico by a crowd of reporters. They all avowed total, bipartisan unity. Congressman Joseph Martin, the House Minority Leader, told a New York Times reporter, "There is no politics here. There is only one party when it comes to the integrity and honor of the country." The lights on the second floor of the White House burned well past midnight, as the president refined drafts of his message. He was helped into bed by his son James. At about 1 in the morning, 5 time zones to the west, darkness fell over Pearl Harbor. A soft rain was falling. A bugler sounded evening colors. Throughout the base, men stopped whatever they were doing, stood to attention, and saluted the flag as it came down. Strict blackout conditions had been ordered and no lights were permitted to show from buildings, ships, cars, or even flashlights. But the East Lock was illuminated by the orange glow of the still-burning West Virginia and Arizona, and by the intense white light of the acetylene torches cutting into the upturned hull of the Oklahoma, where survivors had been heard tapping. A gibbous yellow moon rose in the east, bright enough to cast shadows. Searchlights probed for enemy aircraft flares and red rockets shot up here and there, and intermittent bursts of tracer fire drew geometric patterns across the sky. Night brought with it a heavy sense of foreboding. Rumors circulated quickly, and evolved through repeated retellings. There were said to be enemy submarines in the harbor. There had been troop landings at Barber's Point, Diamond Head, or Kaneohe Bay. Spies and saboteurs were operating within the base itself. One of the most persistent reports, not conclusively refuted until Monday, was that enemy paratroopers had landed in the mountainous interior of Oahu. They were said to be wearing blue coveralls with red rising sun patches on their shoulders. Americans wearing blue uniforms stripped them off to avoid being mistaken for the enemy. In the darkness, imaginations ran wild and every sound seemed grotesquely amplified. Marine Lieutenant Cornelius C. Smith, stationed at the Marine barracks, recalled that his men were even spooked by noises that were recognizable and familiar. A laundry cart rumbles across the asphalt patch out behind the bakery. With all of that weight and those tiny skate wheels, it sounds just like a machine gun. A messman drops a bench end on the concrete deck. A rifle shot. The short-wave set crackles with static. More machine guns. Everywhere, constantly, all night long, men fired their weapons. The target might be a noise, a struck match, a lit cigarette, the headlights of a distant car. Conscientious sentries, when they heard or saw a movement, would shout, "Halt, who goes there, advance and be recognized." Others simply aimed and pulled the trigger. Guards opened fire on the men who had arrived to relieve them. "You could not go 5 feet because somebody would start shooting," said Radioman Ryan, who was assigned to run messages that night. "You wore your whites so that you could be seen in the dark. And you whistled the Star-Spangled Banner so you would be known as an American. Boy, it was risky. I could easily have been shot." Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on lights in the sky, then fell silent as the gunners realized they were shooting at stars. Much of the shooting was merely cathartic, a way to soothe the nerves. At the Navy Yard Tank Farm, a large complex of steel tanks which held the Navy's main fuel reserves in the Pacific, someone accidentally threw the main switch that turned on the floodlights. A voice cried, "Shoot those lights out." Dozens of weapons opened fire. Across the fence, in Hickam Field, the Army guards thought they were under attack and fired back. It was not just a few stray shots, Army Lieutenant Charles Davis recalled, but a genuine firefight with a good amount of volume to it. Surprisingly, no casualties were reported. The Enterprise and her screening ships had made a long, fruitless search to the south. Having found no enemy ships, the Enterprise aircraft turned back, their fuel reserves running low. Most of these planes tracked the blacked-out Enterprise by picking up and following her long phosphorescent wake, and landed safely. But Halsey ordered a squadron of 6 F-4F Wildcat fighter planes, under the command of Lieutenant Fritz Hebel, to return directly to the Naval Air Station on Ford Island. The squadron approached Oahu from the south at 10:45 p.m. Hebel radioed the Ford Island control tower and requested landing instructions. The tower gave him clearance to land and specified that the 6 planes should approach the base with their running lights fully illuminated. It was perfectly obvious to everyone on the ground that the anti-aircraft batteries were manned by nervous gunners, and the risk of a friendly fire incident was very great. The Ford Island Tower broadcast a notice to all ships present and Army anti-aircraft units, advising them of the approach of American planes. The broadcast was repeated a second time, an unusual step, showing the tower's anxiety for the safety of the planes, and the word was passed haphazardly through the anti-aircraft batteries to hold fire. From the ground, the 6 Wildcats were plainly visible as they made their slow approach, losing altitude gradually, their green and red running lights shining brightly. Commander Alan Kewen of the Argonne understood that those were American planes. What sort of enemy pilot would fly over the base at night with his aircraft running lights on? But he also feared for them, given the number of itchy trigger fingers at Pearl Harbor. Will anyone smack them, he wondered. The firing began as the first plane made its final turn to line up with the runway, at an altitude of about 1,000 feet. One of the aft anti-aircraft batteries on the battleship Pennsylvania, flagship of the battle force, opened fire. An instant later, hundreds of guns were blazing away. It looked like the 4th of July, with everybody shooting up there, said gunner's mate Curtis Schultz of the Downs. They had tracers. Mostly, it was small arms fire. From the control tower radio came frantic cries to hold fire, but there were too many guns in too many places. The men on the ground were exultant. By God, said Seaman Mason of the California, this time we were going to shoot back. We took aim at the lights and opened fire with a fierce kind of joy. We were striking back the foe who had so humiliated us. The notion that the planes were American seemed never to enter their minds. We had gotten addicted to shooting at everything that flew during the day, and I guess that it was automatic what we did, said Seaman Fomby. Lieutenant Hebel, over the radio, was heard to cry, "My God, what's happened?" 2 planes were hit immediately, crashing into the channel west of Ford Island and into a tavern named the Palm Inn in Pearl City. Ensign Eric Allen bailed out successfully but was machine-gunned while floating down in his parachute. A 4th pilot, James Daniels, dove low, swooped over the floodlights near the southern edge of the runway, then cut hard left toward Barber's Point. Hebel's plane was hit several times. He pulled away and tried an emergency landing at Wheeler, but his plane skidded into a cane field near Aiea. He was badly injured, and died the following morning. 2 other pilots crashed or bailed out, both surviving with minor injuries. Only Daniels managed to land his plane without injury to himself or damage to his aircraft. There was so much anti-aircraft fire, so many bright red tracer patterns in the sky, that men on the ground were momentarily blinded. As the guns fell silent and the shell bursts faded, Seaman Carl Schmitz of the USS Castor recalled, the sky turned so dark you had a hard time seeing 10 feet in front of you. New sentry boxes were erected outside the White House that night, and at dawn the grounds were swarming with plainclothes Secret Service agents and soldiers wearing trench helmets. The president rose early on Monday, having taken just 4 hours of sleep. He drank his coffee and ate his breakfast while reading the latest dispatches. He dressed, with the help of his valet, in a dark suit and his old blue naval cape. At about 8 that morning, news was carried over the radio that Britain had declared war on Japan. We can only feel that Hitler's madness has infected the Japanese mind, Churchill had told the British people in a BBC broadcast, and that the root of the evil and its branch must be extirpated together. A few minutes after noon, Roosevelt was wheeled out the main entrance of the White House and lifted into his limousine. A 10-car motorcade, which included 3 cars identical to the one carrying the president, roared down Pennsylvania Avenue at twice the speed limit. Men armed with Tommy guns crouched on the running boards. At 12:20 p.m., the convoy pulled up at the south entrance to the Capitol. Roosevelt emerged, unsmiling. In the car he had put on the heavy steel braces that enabled him to stand erect on his ruined legs, and he was able to walk, arduously, on the arm of his son James, a Marine captain. The president barely acknowledged the crowd, described by the Washington Evening Star as a tense, grim throng. The building had not been so heavily guarded since the Civil War. Marines with bayonets on their rifles were posted at entrances, the Star reported, and the Capitol Police, out in full force, formed a secondary line. Cables were stretched along the sidewalks around the house and to hold back the crowd waiting for a glimpse of the president. One congressman, having forgotten his identification, pushed his way through a phalanx of soldiers and was very nearly shot. The cabinet, as solemn as owls, filed into the House chamber. They were followed by the entire Senate and the 9 members of the Supreme Court. The galleries were packed with reporters, photographers, and cameramen. At 12:29 p.m., Speaker Sam Rayburn brought his gavel down on the rostrum and shouted, "The President of the United States." BBC correspondent Alistair Cook, observing the scene from the press gallery, described a long, nervous interval as Roosevelt made his way to the dais. The clicking of the president's leg braces could be plainly heard as he edged up the ramp to the podium, with one arm locked in his son's, the other hand feeling every inch of the long sloping rail. The cameras would not roll until the president was safely behind the podium, his disability primly hidden away, but every soul in the crowded chamber had seen his pained exertions, and the metaphor was too palpable to be missed. Cook wrote, before we heard his confident tenor and listened to the sincere automatic applause, we saw him walk and thought of the wounded battleships slumped over in Pearl Harbor. Eleanor Roosevelt, dressed in black with a silver fox fur, sat in the galleries near Edith Wilson, who had sat in this chamber 23 years earlier to hear her husband, President Woodrow Wilson, ask for a declaration of war against Germany. Now the President of the United States was my husband, wrote Eleanor, and for the second time in my life I heard the President tell the Congress that this nation was engaged in a war. I was deeply unhappy. I remembered my anxiety about my husband and brother when World War I began. Now I had 4 sons of military age. The President stood at the podium, leg braces locked, and gripped the sides of the rostrum for support. He put on his glasses, opened a black loose-leaf notebook, and began to speak. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The timing of the raid, Roosevelt declared, left no doubt that it had been planned and executed while the Japanese and American governments were engaged in recent diplomatic negotiations, and that Japan had thus deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace, he detailed. All of the attacks Japan had launched in the previous 24 hours: Midway, Wake, Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, and concluded. Japan has, therefore, undertaken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday speak for themselves. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory. Congress, the Evening Star reported, was solemn and angered as the president delivered his address, but several lines were punctuated by thunderclaps of powerful applause and foot stamping. With his concluding words, "We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God," the entire chamber rose to their feet and presented a deafening ovation. Roosevelt raised a hand and left the podium, escorted once again by his son. The speech had lasted a mere 5 minutes, and the phrase "a date which will live in infamy" was the only line that most Americans would ever remember, but it had attracted the largest audience in the history of radio, 60 million, according to the ratings. He had written it entirely himself, without contribution from his speechwriters. The playwright and presidential aide Robert Sherwood remarked of Roosevelt, "I do not think there was another occasion in his life when he was so completely representative of the whole people." An hour later, a declaration of war passed both houses, with 1 dissenting vote in the House and none in the Senate. Roosevelt was still on the radio as the sun rose over Pearl Harbor. A soft rain was falling over the half-sunken, still blazing battleships West Virginia and Arizona. Fireboats continued to work them over with hoses, and immense columns of greasy, black, evil-smelling smoke continued to roll into the sky. On Ford Island, men stumbled into the mess halls for coffee and breakfast, their eyes puffy, faces drawn, unshaven, and dirty. Few had slept at all, and many had neglected to eat since the previous morning's attack. For 24 hours they had been fueled by nervous energy and adrenaline, and were only now realizing that they were exhausted and wolfishly hungry. At the Naval Hospital, a handsome stucco building wreathed in palm trees along the Navy Yard side of the harbor, the short-handed staff had been working without respite since the previous morning. It had been a long and petrifying night. Small arms and anti-aircraft fire kept up a constant din, persuading the doctors and nurses that a battle was raging outside the windows. Surgeons struggled to keep their hands from shaking while bent over the operating tables. At about 11 o'clock, when an exploding flak shell blew out many of the windows of the upper floors, doctors, nurses, corpsmen, and patients had cried out all together in fright. The nurses had worked relentlessly, mechanically, without relief, doing what they were trained to do, sterilizing trays of instruments, giving shots, setting up intravenous feeds, changing dressings. Observing strict blackout conditions, they worked with flashlights covered with blue carbon paper to dim the light. It seemed obvious that a Japanese invasion was underway. Having been warned of how the Japanese would treat female prisoners, some of the nurses carried pocket knives and resolved to slash their wrists if the hospital was taken. Dawn brought a puissant sense of relief. No one could imagine what daylight meant to us, said Lieutenant Ruth Erickson, a nurse at the hospital. We could now see outside. Even the air was cleaner, purer. There was a feeling that we had made it. Our material possessions meant nothing. The fact that we were alive, that was the full meaning. We had prayed many times, and we were grateful that our prayers had been answered. With daylight, casualties continued to arrive at the hospital in great numbers. As the wards filled, the corpsmen pushed the beds closer together to make room for more. The burn cases were the worst. The standard weekend uniform at Pearl Harbor was shorts and short-sleeve shirts, leaving exposed skin on the arms and legs. A witness described the wounds as charred, crisp skin like bacon rind, black and oozing. Burns were treated with a variety of dressings, mineral oil sprays, sulfanilamide powder, tannic acid, boric acid. But not much could be done for the men in the burn wards, except to keep them heavily dosed with anesthetic. The smell of burnt flesh permeated the hospital, especially at night when the blackout curtains prevented air from circulating. I can still smell it, recalled Lieutenant Erickson, many years afterward, and I think I always will. The dead were placed in white canvas body bags and moved out to the lawn in front of the hospital. Not all of those who had been declared dead were actually dead. Witnesses were horrified to hear muffled groans from within some of the bags. I started to go back and see, recalled Vivian Hultgren, an Army wife, and then my reasoning said, well, they must be so badly damaged that they cannot be helped. They must just be on their last legs. So what can I do? And that just really haunted me. In the harbor, dozens of bodies were floating to the surface, and motor launches were assigned to bring them to IAEA landing for identification and burial. At first the crews hauled the bodies into the boats, said Seaman Jack Kelly of the Tennessee, but it got to where, if we pulled them into the boat, they would bust open and run all over the bottom of the boat. So we would just tie a little piece of rope around their leg or their arm or whatever you could get a hold of and get you a string of them and tow them over rather than trying to pull them into the boat. Another sailor assigned to that grisly duty remembered, the worst part was when the body would start to disintegrate, and we would have to stop in the middle of the tow and relash. On the previous afternoon, civilian lumberyards in Honolulu had been ordered to build as many pine coffins as they could, and these were transported to Pearl Harbor by the truckload. At IAEA landing, medical corpsmen wearing rubber gloves took dental impressions in the effort to identify the dead. Identified bodies were placed in a numbered box, and a record made of the dead man's name. But many bodies or parts of bodies could not be identified, and these were distributed at random into boxes. Trucks were loaded with coffins and driven to Oahu Cemetery, where bulldozers were digging 150-foot-long trenches. It was necessary to get the dead under the ground as soon as possible. Many coffins were leaking blood and oil, and men handling them had to wear masks to cover the odor. It was a gruesome task. One flatbed truck came up, stopped abruptly, and a box fell off, said Marine Private LaFan, who spent several days working at the cemetery. It hit the concrete and burst. There was the trunk of a man, 3 arms, and 1 leg in this particular box. For weeks after the attack, funeral ceremonies were held continuously. When a dead man could not be identified, a priest, a rabbi, and a minister would sometimes preside over a single burial. An honor guard would sound taps and place a wooden stake over each grave. In a newspaper photograph of one such ceremony, held shortly after the attack, civilians and uniformed naval officers stand with heads bowed while a trio of grass-skirted Hawaiian women play ukuleles and sing Aloha O. Throughout the base, there were alternating scenes of jubilation and grief as men discovered who among their shipmates had survived and who had not. Survivors described a kaleidoscope of contradictory feelings. Some were relieved at having escaped with their lives and limbs intact. Seaman Theodore Mason remembered a peculiar celebration in the shower of the CINCPAC administration building, as a number of sailors were scrubbing the oil from their bodies. A feeling of elation possessed me, he remembered. I was alive. The other men in the shower shouted and laughed and sang. I joined them. Hard on the heels of that curious euphoria came a crushing sense of guilt and shame. How many of my shipmates were dead, wounded, hideously burned? Mason asked himself. Why was I singing? It took years, and additional combat experience, before I forgave myself. Most of the enlisted men and junior officers at Pearl Harbor were young, in their late teens and early 20s, and they admitted feeling confused about the causes of the war. Many were not in the habit of reading the newspapers, except the comic strips or sports pages, and had not paid much attention to the deterioration of U.S.-Japanese relations in the last months before the war. Japan, and all of Asia, had seemed remote and not particularly important to their lives or to the lives of their families and friends at home. Virtually no one had taken Japan seriously as a military threat. Now, as the Pacific battle force lay in ruins, they felt a pervasive sense of collective disgrace. Friends back home used to ask about the Japs, recalled Marine Lieutenant Cornelius C. Smith, Jr. Hell, we could blow them out of the water in 3 weeks, but here we are with our pants down and the striking force of our Pacific Fleet is settling on the bottom of East Loch, Pearl Harbor. Who would not be ashamed? Seaman Nick Correttas wondered how he could ever face his family again. What am I going to say to them? He asked himself. How can I explain this? As terrible as the fate of the Arizona had been, many witnesses were even more shaken by the sight of the Oklahoma. After being hit by a barrage of aerial torpedoes, she had listed to starboard and then rolled nearly vertical, leaving her gigantic steel hull pointed up to the sky and her superstructure buried in the soft mud bottom of the harbor. 3 generations of officers and enlisted men had been taught to believe that every battleship was a fortress, permanent and impregnable. For such a ship to roll over like a toy boat in a bathtub seemed ludicrous, almost inconceivable. But there she was. Gunner's Mate 3rd Class George E. Waller of the Maryland recalled. We had been told all of our lives that you could not sink a battleship, and then to see one go upside down. It was heartbreaking. But the carriers had survived. At least the carriers had survived. Admiral William F. Halsey's Task Force 8, the Enterprise and her accompanying cruisers and destroyers had been safely at sea on the morning of the attack. They had been due back in Pearl Harbor on Sunday morning, but on Saturday afternoon, northwest of Oahu, a line dropped by a destroyer had managed to wrap itself around one of the propeller shafts of the cruiser Northampton. It was the kind of familiar mishap that routinely beset ships operating in close formation at sea, usually prompting savage recriminations, blame trading, and fusillades of profanity. The entire task force had lingered as divers worked to unravel the fouled line. When news of the air raid arrived by radio the next morning, the ships had steamed hundreds of miles south in a long, fruitless search, thereby avoiding Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers, which had withdrawn to the north. Had Halsey chased north, he would have thrust his 2 carriers into striking range of Nagumo's 6, and with such overpowering force the combat-hardened Japanese aviators might easily have sent both the Enterprise and Lexington to the bottom. At sunset on Monday, with 7 destroyers following in a single file, the Enterprise crept down the long outer channel into Pearl Harbor. She inched around the stern of the crippled battleship Nevada, which lay beached on the western edge of the channel with her bow thrust into a grove of algaroba trees. In the failing light, men stationed on the carrier's bridge, flight deck, and catwalks took in enough to understand what had happened in their absence: the charred remains of seaplanes and hangars on Ford Island, the smell of fuel oil and roasted paint, the fires still burning in the half-sunken ships, the columns of smoke still spewing into the sky. One of the Enterprise's own 4 F-4 fighters, shot down the previous evening by friendly fire, was half awash in the shallows near the channel. Passing 1010 dock, they saw the half-sunken remains of the minesweeper Oglala, plugged with 3 Japanese torpedoes apparently intended for the Enterprise. A heavy blanket of black fuel oil lay across the water of the harbor. Boats motoring through it raised barely a wake, lifting the oil water surface, a sailor recalled, in sullen little folds that fell back at once into the overall black melancholy. The base was mostly dark and silent, observing strict blackout conditions for the second night of the war. But a few sarcastic voices called out to the gaping crew of the Enterprise as she crept past the stricken battleships. Where in hell were you? And you would better get out of here or the Japs will get you too. Ordnanceman Alvin Kernan, observing the carnage from the flight deck, reflected that in a violent way the attack had announced that the day of the battleship was gone. The Enterprise and a handful of other aircraft carriers had been unwittingly thrust into the vanguard of the naval war. To men who had learned their trade in a fleet dominated by battleships, that was a sobering prospect, but now the war must be waged by the carriers or not at all, because there was not anything else. Admiral Halsey, watching with gritted teeth from the Enterprise flag bridge, was heard to mutter, "Before we were through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." Whatever their misgivings, whatever evils the war might bring, their longing for vengeance would nourish and sustain them, As soon as the carrier's dock lines were secured to a Ford Island berth, Halsey descended into a launch that would take him to see Admiral Kimmel at CINCPAC headquarters on the other side of the lock. The boat was fired upon as it motored toward the Navy Yard landing, and it was only the darkness of the night that saved Halsey from being shot. He found Kimmel and his staff haggard and unshaven, still wearing their Sunday whites, which were crumpled and stained with blood, dirt, and oil. As he sat with Kimmel, new and far-fetched rumors circulated through the headquarters. 1. A report that Japanese troops had been seen landing in gliders, prompted Halsey to chuckle. "What the hell is there to laugh at?" demanded Kimmel. Halsey said the report was obvious. Bunked gliders did not have the range to fly from any Japanese island base, and the Japanese carriers would never waste deck space on any such nonsense. His reasoning was unassailable. As a carrier admiral, he intuited what Kimmel by then suspected, that the Japanese were long gone, and the ongoing contact reports were products of mass hysteria. The previous morning's attack had been a hit-and-run carrier air raid, and the enemy flat-tops were now well on their way back toward Japan. As the Enterprise berthed, the fuel lines were hauled aboard from a waiting tanker and inserted into her tanks. Refueling and reprovisioning continued at a hurried pace through the small hours of the morning. All wanted to be safely back to sea by first light. A long line of sailors snaked from the dock up a gangway through the hangar deck and down the ladders to the magazines and galleys, and through those hundreds of pairs of hands were passed the rounds of ammunition and victuals to replenish the Enterprise's stores. New crew members reported aboard, many bringing nothing but the uniforms on their backs, because their sea bags were entombed on Battleship Row. By 4 in the morning, the Enterprise had drunk her fill of fuel oil and loaded all the ammunition and stores she could carry. Admiral Halsey came aboard without ceremony. Provisions were stacked on her hangar deck in unseamanlike fashion, waiting to be properly stowed below, but there was no time to lose. Dawn was imminent. Her lines were cast off and she retraced her route past the wrecked battleships, Hospital Point, the seaplane base, then made a slight course adjustment a few points to starboard, and headed back toward the beached Nevada, marking the passage to the open sea. Leaving the miserable waste of Pearl Harbor behind, recalled Alvin Kernan, the Enterprise sailed down the channel, through the nets, and into the blue water, picking up speed as she went, the sun rising, the water beginning to hiss alongside, and the smell of oil, charred paint, bodies, and defeat left far behind. The planes landed aboard later and the war had begun. In Washington, the first chaotic stages of mobilization had been set in motion. Alistair Cooke was reminded of a silent film of the vaudevillian era, when the resting firemen, grown amiable on undisturbed sessions of beer and games of pinochle, are electrified by the alarm and, diving headlong down the greasy pole, start to clomp importantly in every part of town. Military units and trucks seized major intersections, causing monumental traffic jams on both Monday and Tuesday. Machine gun nests and anti-aircraft units were set up on the roofs of public buildings. This being December, darkness fell in late afternoon, and as a precaution against enemy air raids, the city's streetlights and the huge floodlights which normally lit up the Capitol dome were left dark. Air raid wardens waved down cars and shined flashlights into the eyes of motorists and pedestrians, asking impudent and idiotic questions. 4 cherry trees on the Washington Mall were chopped down by some zealous patriot, presumably because they had been a gift from the Japanese government. Fear and confusion were everywhere evident. A downtown building caught fire, and when the fire engine sirens sounded, residents assumed that hostile planes were overhead. As in communities all around the country, there was a panic of buying, as people hoarded food and other consumer goods in anticipation of rationing or shortages.